You're listening to Puma Podcast.
A majority of urban Filipinos believe that Presidents Rodrigo Duterte and Ferdinand Marcos Sr., leaders associated with authoritarian practices, had a beneficial impact on Philippine democracy. Specifically, Marcos Sr. and Rodrigo Duterte were viewed favorably in terms of having been nakabuti for Philippine democracy. Nearly half, 49%, mentioned that Marcos Sr. was good for the Philippine democracy, while a striking 62% did so for President Duterte. These proportions are significantly higher than those for other post-EDSA presidents, where only 30% expressed a similar positive assessment for other presidents.
A multi-city survey conducted by Jesuit schools reveals that Filipinos have strikingly complex views on democracy and how it works.
The survey targeted Filipinos aged 18 and above in 6 major urban centers: Metro Manila, Naga City, Cebu City, Cagayan de Oro, Davao City, and Zamboanga. We coordinated with a survey firm, the WR Numero, which conducted the survey from December 2 to 21 last year to face-to-face computer-assisted personal interviews using a randomized multi-stage household sampling method.
That's Randy Tuaño, Dean of the Ateneo School of Government. He led the unveiling of these survey results at the launch of the Philippine Observatory on Democracy, a Jesuit initiative, on April 29, 2025.
160 respondents per city. In total, it's 842 respondents were surveyed, yielding an average margin of error of about plus or minus 5.2%, which is close to the margins of errors in large surveys.
Filipinos prefer democracy over autocracy, but that preference is fragile and weakening further. Filipinos prefer democracy, but they want strong men to lead it. Filipinos prefer democracy, but don't find it urgent to uphold the liberal values that define it. We get into it in this episode of Teka Teka. I'm Bella Perez-Rubio.
One question that we asked now was whether Filipinos are satisfied with the current state of democracy. We found that while democracy remains the preferred form of government, only 41% of Filipinos surveyed express a clear preference for it. Alarmingly, 37% say they do not care whether the government is democratic or authoritarian, and 19% actually prefer authoritarian governance under certain conditions. These findings point a weakening attachment to democracy among urban Filipinos, and also confirm findings in other studies in Asia that there is high general support for democracy as the best form of government, but a low commitment to it when it competes with economic priorities or regime performance. When asked whether Philippine democracy today meets their ideals, only 31% actually agree. Half of our respondents describe Philippine democracy as far from ideal, reflecting a deep gap between democratic ideals Filipinos value and the lived political realities that they experience. So this begs the question: if urban Filipinos think that Philippine democracy is far from ideal, what then is their concept of an ideal democracy? The interviewers asked them just one word. What is the first thing that comes to mind when the word democracy is said? So the first thing that comes to their mind is still kalayaan or freedom. Other strong associations include equality, peace, and government. These are followed by associations with the government, kalinaw or peacefulness, pagkapantay-pantay, equality. However, it is significant that negative associations also surface, with some respondents linking democracy to kaguluhan or chaos. This hints at a complex understanding with democracy, where liberal values are clearly associated but perhaps perceived as difficult or messy in practice. It is telling that many also associate democracy with chaos. This suggests that for a significant portion of Filipinos, democracy is both an aspiration and a source of unease. Filipinos in 6 cities recognize the essential features of liberal democracy. The top 3 most frequently selected elements are: first, respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms, 59%, the respondents; second, the holding of free and fair elections, 45%; and third, upholding the integrity of the court system, 40%. Despite these strong ideals, perceptions of democracy in relation to historical events and key governance figures hint at a different story. The majority cite human rights and fundamental freedoms, the conduct of free and fair elections, and the presence of a credible judiciary as the foundations of a democratic system. These are encouraging signs that the core ideals of democracy remain intact in the Filipino political imagination. Despite these democratic ideals, perception of historical figures reveal contradictions.
That brings us to the findings you heard at the top of this episode. Marcos Sr., the dictator, and Rodrigo Duterte, the former president detained at The Hague over alleged crimes against humanity, were singled out as the two Filipino leaders most beneficial to democracy. Duterte was chosen by 62% of those surveyed, while 49% selected Marcos Sr.
The regimes of both leaders, Marcos Sr. and Duterte, are widely documented for serious abuses of democratic principles. Marcos Sr. for suppressing civil liberty under martial law, and Duterte for widespread human rights abuses associated with an anti-illegal drug campaign. This raises questions about how democratic values are reconciled with historical memory. This paradox is further evident when we ask about the 1986 People Power Revolution. Only 33% see EDSA 1 as beneficial to democracy, while slightly higher numbers said martial law had a positive effect. It shows that collective memory about democracy milestones is shifting and perhaps fragmenting.
This set of results ignited the strongest reaction in the room. Perhaps the most visceral was from Tesam Castillo, the managing director of AJ Kalinga, a non-profit dedicated to the poor and the wounded.
Ako po si Tesam. Maybe just a short background. I was an activist and NGO worker for 23 years and also served in government for four presidents for 22 years. As a martial law victim, as a former political detainee, I am both against Duterte and Marcos. So, nakaka-disturb yung result na 62% and 49%. So, do the results tell us now, or tell me, that we, or ako mismo, at the civil society organizations, or NGOs, or development workers, or even people's organizations, do the results tell us that we have chosen weak strategies in the past? I'm one of the senior activists. Maybe most of you are so young here. But are you telling us now, or do the results tell us that we have chosen the weaker strategies in making our Filipinos understand or even internalize or practice democracy?
That question from Tesam is one of the questions, if not the question, driving this entire exercise. And there are a few answers worth considering. Here's one from Julio Teehankee, a leading political analyst who teaches at De La Salle University.
One way of looking at it would be democratic ambivalence. Particularly in the region, Asia has not been fertile ground for democratic values, although in the Philippines, we are a cut above the rest because we prefer democracy, but we also consider it as being messy. And our version of democracy is democracy guided by a strong arm. So whether that's still democracy, that's part of our continuing conversation. It's actually about performance legitimacy and what makes Singapore as the proof of concept that authoritarian works is that if you go to Singapore, you can see the evidence immediately, right? But it's not a fully consolidated democracy. It's not even a democracy, although it pretends to be one, right? So for a typical Filipino, we all want to be like Singapore. There's order, everything works, the train comes on time, etc. So it's really about outcome. And right now, even within the liberal circles, there's a shift of focusing too much on markets and more on abundance.
In other words, while urban Filipinos recognize core democratic ideals like human rights and free elections, perhaps for many, Democracy is judged less by traditional liberal freedoms or checks and balances, and more by whether leaders deliver tangible results and project strength. The survey shows that urban Filipinos prioritize social protection, education, health, and employment when considering democracy's urgent needs today. They showed a clear preference for socioeconomic rights and immediately tangible benefits, prioritizing them over civil liberties like freedom of expression, academic freedom, and press freedom.
And this is what they call abundance liberalism or abundance economics, in which it's really about output, outcome. And I think the only remedy to fake news, disinformation is if we raise the quality of life of our people to the point that they can have autonomy to decide, and that is really the lifeline, the lifeblood of any functioning democracy.
Here's another set of findings that supports his theory, narrated again by Dean Randy Tuaño of the Ateneo School of Government.
So, what do Filipinos hope for Philippine democracy? When asked about their democratic aspirations, Filipinos prioritize social and economic rights such as social protection and access to competitive elections over civil liberties. What do urban Filipinos deem most urgently for the functioning of democracy today? They revealed that the prioritization of socioeconomic concerns and basic state functions over liberal rights, presenting another facet of the gap between abstract ideals and practical priorities on democracy. When asked to identify the three most urgent aspects, the highest priority was given to social protection, encompassing education and health, selected by 60% of our respondents, followed closely by clean and competitive elections, 54%, and ensuring economic rights such as employment, 49%.
Liberal values traditionally associated with democracy, like upholding fundamental freedoms, civil liberties, respect for minority rights, and transparency and accountability, were deemed urgent by less than 10% of those surveyed.
This pronounced emphasis on socioeconomic rights and electoral integrity over civil liberties and institutional checks suggests that for many Filipinos, the immediate tangible benefits and perceived fairness of the economic and social system hold greater urgency than the procedural and liberal dimensions of politics. This shows that a more substantive and social justice-centered view of democracy has been emerging among Filipinos today. Still, when given options to improve democracy, a strong preference emerges. 63% of Filipinos want a strong president backed by people, Congress, and courts. This suggests a cultural inclination towards centralized leadership rather than institutional strengthening or expanded civic participation. This path garnered significantly more support than alternatives such as limiting presidential power, the balance between executive and legislative branches, functioning institutions such as the government, education, healthcare systems, credible and efficient judiciary, and the emphasis on people's participation.
Again, this goes back to the well-documented Asian preference for democracy guided by a strong arm that Professor Teehankee mentioned earlier. Here's another possible answer to that question from martial law survivor and activist Tesam Castillo, this time from Carlo Abadines, Executive Director of Simbahang Lingkod ng Bayan, the socio-political arm of the Jesuits in the Philippines.
I think the trend is clear, no? Democratic backsliding is really happening worldwide and in the regions, and there may be multiple factors for it. One, I think we really need to confront ourselves as civil society, no? And I think there are more studies coming out, which I mentioned kanina po, no? Baka nga may disconnect talaga ang iniisip ng mga leaders with how we're connecting with the ground, because it's clear also that our bases are becoming weaker. Less and less people are associated with civil society, democratic forces, no? So that might be a question of strategy, that might be a question of imagination, that might be a question of whether we're actually connecting on the ground. Of course, there are other factors. For example, economic factors that are very big factors. Like, for example, the labor sector has weakened. No, unionization is lower because of union busting, all kinds of So may mga factors na ganun. But maybe there's one other trend that I like to think about for us and in democracy. Maybe it's really idea called atomization. No, I think there is a strong social correlation between people's growing individualism and atomization and the decline of democracy because people are not anymore connected to their communities. If 3 out of 10 only feel that they're part of their communities, how would you want to be participating in groups and democracy? But people are not congregating anymore to actually assert themselves in certain arenas, in community forces. And hindi ko alam kung kasalanan natin yon or kasalanan yun na the trends are just there.
That's it for today's episode of Teka Teka. I'm Bella Perez-Rubio. This episode was edited by Anthony Tobias. We'll be back soon with an episode covering midterm election results, what they mean, and what to expect from our new Congress. If you'd like to hear it once it's out, make sure to follow Puma Podcast on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.